The Vatican wasn't always 110 acres of Renaissance splendor surrounded by medieval walls. It
But unlike
began as a swamp. The Ager Vaticanus, the Vatican field, was where ancient Romans buried their dead, far from the sacred boundaries of the city proper. It was here, according to tradition, that Simon Peter, a Galilean fisherman who had walked with Jesus, was crucified upside down by Emperor Nero's executioners around 64 AD. The Romans left his body in a common grave, and for nearly 3 centuries Christians visited the site in secret, marking it with graffiti scratched into walls. "Peter is within." What happened next transformed this cemetery for outcasts into the nerve center of Western civilization. By the 4th century, Emperor Constantine had constructed a massive basilica over Peter's presumed tomb, and the Bishop of Rome, Peter's successor, began claiming authority not just over souls, but over kingdoms. The transition from persecuted sect to imperial power broker happened so swiftly that even contemporary observers struggled to comprehend it. The historian Eusebius wrote in wonder about Constantine's conversion, calling it a moment when the whole human race was freed from the oppression of the tyrants. What he didn't mention was that the Church had simply found a new emperor to serve or perhaps to control. The genius of the early popes was recognizing that spiritual authority could be converted into temporal power more efficiently than armies could. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, leaving a power vacuum across Europe, Pope Leo I had already established a precedent by personally confronting Attila the Hun in 452 AD near Mantua, convincing the warlord to spare Rome. Whether through divine intervention, bribery, or the outbreak of disease in Attila's camp, historians still debate the Pope succeeded where legions had failed. The image was indelible, an unarmed holy man stopping a barbarian horde through moral force alone. By the 8th century, Pope Stephen II was negotiating directly with Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, securing military protection in exchange for legitimizing Pepin's usurpation of the Frankish throne. The transaction was recorded in the Donation of Pepin in 754 AD, granting the Pope control over central Italian territories that became the Papal States. To justify this land grab, the Vatican produced the Donation of Constantine, a document claiming that Emperor Constantine had given the papacy sovereignty over Rome and the Western Empire in the 4th century. It was a complete forgery, definitively proven fake in 1440 by the scholar Lorenzo Valla, but by then it had served its purpose for 7 centuries. The popes had learned that controlling the past, even a fabricated past, granted authority over the present. This dual nature of the papacy, simultaneously Christ's vicar on earth and a territorial monarch commanding armies, created tensions that would define European history. When Pope Urban II stood before the Council of Clermont in France on the 27th of November 1095, he wasn't merely calling for a pilgrimage. "Deus vult, God wills it," the crowd chanted as Urban announced the First Crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control. Within months, tens of thousands of warriors, peasants, and opportunists were marching east under the banner of the cross. Urban promised them something unprecedented: complete absolution of sins for anyone who died fighting. It was spiritual authority weaponized, and it worked spectacularly. When Crusaders captured Jerusalem in July 1099, they massacred tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews in scenes that shocked even medieval chroniclers. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum wrote that in the Temple of Solomon, Crusaders rode in blood up to their horses' knees. Pope Urban died 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell, never learning of his campaign's success, but the precedent was set. The Pope could command Christian kings to war, could redistribute kingdoms, could declare entire populations heretical and subject to extermination. When Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209 against the Cathars in southern France, papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly responded to soldiers asking how to distinguish heretics from Catholics. "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." 20 years of warfare depopulated Languedoc and eliminated the Cathar faith entirely, demonstrating that papal power extended not just over foreign infidels, but over Christian communities that departed from orthodox doctrine. The medieval papacy accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled any European monarch. The Vatican developed sophisticated financial instruments, indulgences, benefices, simony that transformed salvation into a commodity. When Pope Boniface VIII declared the first Jubilee year in 1300, promising plenary indulgences to pilgrims who visited Rome's basilicas, the chronicler Giovanni Villani estimated that 2 million people came, filling the papal treasury with offerings. Boniface, who had previously declared in his bull Unam Sanctam that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, used the wealth to wage war against the Colonna family and other Italian rivals. His claims of absolute authority over all earthly rulers provoked King Philip IV of France to send agents who arrested the Pope at Anagni in 1303, physically assaulting him before a rescue by local citizens. Boniface died within weeks, but the incident revealed the limits of papal pretensions. Within a few years, the papacy had moved to Avignon, France, where it would remain for 70 years in what critics called the Babylonian captivity, serving as an instrument of French policy. The Vatican was discovering that temporal power made it vulnerable to temporal forces. When the Renaissance transformed European culture, the papacy transformed with it, not towards spiritual renewal, but toward unprecedented opulence and corruption. The papal treasury financed Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's frescoes, and Bramante's reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, but the money came from selling salvation. Pope Leo X, a Medici who reportedly said upon his election in 1513, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," expanded the indulgence trade to fund St. Peter's construction. The Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, traveled through Germany with a sales pitch that enraged reformers. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1517, he wasn't protesting doctrine, he was protesting the Vatican's commercialization of grace. The Protestant Reformation that followed split Christianity permanently and stripped the papacy of authority over half of Europe. Yet Rome responded not with spiritual reform, but with military and political counterattack. The Counter-Reformation Council of Trent reaffirmed every doctrine Luther had challenged and established the Roman Inquisition to enforce orthodoxy through torture and execution. The Vatican had chosen institutional preservation over reconciliation, temporal power over spiritual unity. The loss of the Papal States in 1870 seemed to end the Vatican's political existence. When Italian forces captured Rome on the 20th of September 1870, completing the unification of Italy, Pope Pius IX retreated into the Vatican palaces and declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican. For 59 years, successive popes refused to recognize the Italian state, forbade Catholics from participating in Italian politics, and waited for restoration of their temporal kingdom. But this forced spiritual focus was brief. On the 11th of February 1929, Benito Mussolini and Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, representing Pope Pius XI, signed the Lateran Treaty in the Lateran Palace. The agreement created Vatican City as an independent sovereign state, the world's smallest country, at 17 square miles, and paid the Holy See 750 million lire in compensation for the lost papal states. More importantly, it granted the Vatican diplomatic immunity, its own postal system, railway station, and exemption from Italian law. Article 11 recognized the Vatican's right to maintain diplomatic relations with other nations, resurrecting the papacy as a global political force. Mussolini needed legitimacy. The Church needed sovereignty. Pius XI called Mussolini a man sent by Providence, conveniently overlooking the dictator's fascist ideology. The Vatican had regained temporal power by aligning with a regime that would soon align with Hitler. The Vatican's conduct during World War II remains one of the most contested chapters in its history. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Pope Pius XII, the former Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who had served as papal nuncio to Germany, issued his first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus, condemning totalitarianism in abstract terms without naming Germany or any specific regime. As the Holocaust unfolded, Jewish leaders pleaded for papal denunciation. Rabbi Isaac Herzog of Jerusalem wrote to the Vatican in 1943, "The inhuman treatment that the Nazis and their collaborators continue to inflict on the Jews cries out to heaven." Yet Pius XII maintained diplomatic neutrality, even as trains carrying Jews to death camps rolled through Catholic countries, even as the SS rounded up over 1,000 Jews from Rome's ghetto within sight of St. Peter's Dome on the 16th of October 1943. The Pope's Christmas message that year mentioned hundreds of thousands of persons who, without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, are marked down for death or progressive extinction. But he didn't say Jews or Nazis. Defenders argue Pius XII worked behind the scenes, that Catholic institutions hid thousands of Jews, that open condemnation would have provoked worse Nazi retaliation. Critics counter that the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany throughout the war, that the papal nuncio attended Hitler's birthday celebrations, that moral authority unused is worthless. After the war, the Vatican Bank helped finance ratlines that spirited Nazi war criminals like Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, to safety in South America. Bishop Alois Hudel operated openly from Rome, providing false papers and Vatican assistance to escaping SS officers. When Argentina's military dictatorship tortured and murdered thousands in the 1972nd and 1982nd, many perpetrators were alumni of these Vatican-facilitated escape networks, suggesting the ratlines had created an international fascist underground with ongoing connections to church institutions. The Vatican's secret archives, officially renamed the Apostolic Archives in 2019, embody the Church's relationship with its own history-controlled, selective, weaponized. The archives contain an estimated 35,000 volumes catalogued, with vast sections remaining unorganized and inaccessible. The collection spans 12 centuries of documents, from an 1198 letter from Pope Innocent III to the proclamation of the Fourth Crusade, to Henry VIII's petition for annulment decorated with the seals of English nobility, to the 1,633 trial records of Galileo Galilei. That last document is particularly revealing. When Galileo was forced to kneel before the Inquisition and recant his claim that Earth orbits the Sun, "I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies," he read from a script the Church wasn't merely defending biblical literalism, it was defending its authority to determine reality itself. The Inquisition documents record Galileo being shown the instruments of torture, though whether they were used remains disputed. The Church didn't officially admit Galileo was correct until 1992, when Pope John Paul II acknowledged the astronomer had been right. 359 years to admit an observable fact, that's the Vatican's timeline for transparency. Access to the archives requires academic credentials, institutional sponsorship, and approval by the prefect, who can deny requests without explanation. Each researcher can request only 3 documents per day, making comprehensive study of any topic potentially take decades. Whole sections remain sealed, including all documents from the pontificate of Pius XII until 2020, when Pope Francis opened materials through 1,958. Yet even that opening came with restrictions. Researchers discovered that sensitive materials had been retained for further study, including documents about Vatican finances and certain correspondence with Nazi officials. The Vatican maintains that some materials are withheld to protect living persons or diplomatic relations, a justification that becomes absurd when applied to events from 80 years ago. What could be so damaging in documents from 1945 that they cannot be revealed in 2025? The answer likely involves money and collaboration. The Vatican Bank's transactions with German companies that used slave labor, the Church's knowledge of, and silence about specific atrocities, the quid pro quo arrangements between the Holy See and fascist regimes. The British historian John Cornwall, author of Hitler's Pope, was denied access to specific files he requested about Pius XII's pre-war negotiations with Hitler. When the Vatican did provide documents, Cornwall found them carefully selected to present the Pope in the best possible light. The archives aren't a neutral repository of history. They're a weapon in an ongoing battle to control how that history is understood. The tension between the Vatican's divine mission and its temporal power creates a fundamental contradiction that has never been resolved. When Pope Gregory VII forced Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV to stand barefoot in the snow at Canossa for 3 days in January 1077, begging forgiveness for challenging papal authority, he demonstrated that spiritual power could humble kings. Yet Gregory died in exile, overthrown by the same emperor he had humiliated. His last words reportedly, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Every pope faces the same dilemma: claim too much worldly power and become vulnerable to worldly forces, claim too little and become irrelevant to the political realities that shape human lives. The solution the Vatican adopted was to claim everything while concealing the mechanisms of control. Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pope in history, declared in 1198, "The Pope holds the place of the true God in this world." Yet he also excommunicated King John of England, placed France under interdict, and organized the Fourth Crusade that sacked Christian Constantinople instead of liberating Jerusalem. The divine and political were inseparable because the Vatican had made them so, and separating them now would require admitting that perhaps they never belonged together in the first place. On the 18th of June 1982, a banker's body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets stuffed with bricks and $15,000 in cash spread across 3 currencies. Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's largest private bank, had been missing for 9 days. The initial ruling was self-inflicted death, but the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Calvi was known as God's banker for his intimate connections with the Vatican Bank, and Blackfriars, the bridge named for the Dominican order whose members wore black cloaks, seemed a deliberate message. In his briefcase, discovered later, were documents detailing how $3 billion had disappeared through a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank. The money trail led through Panama, the Bahamas, Peru, and Luxembourg, connecting the Holy See to Italy's largest post-war financial scandal, the Sicilian Mafia, the illegal Masonic Lodge, Propaganda Due, and possibly the CIA. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the Chicago-born president of the Vatican Bank who stood 6'4" and had served as Pope Paul VI's bodyguard, was implicated as a key figure in the scheme. When Italian prosecutors issued a warrant for his arrest in 1982, Marcinkus retreated behind Vatican walls, protected by diplomatic immunity under the Lateran Treaty. He would never stand trial. Pope John Paul II transferred him to a position in Vatican City proper in 1990, ensuring he couldn't be extradited even if he left the bank's offices, and Marcinkus remained there until the investigation's statute of limitations expired. In 2007, a year after Marcinkus died in Sun City, Arizona, a mafia supergrass named Francesco Marino Manoia told prosecutors that Calvi had been murdered on orders from Cosa Nostra boss Giuseppe Pippo Calò because the banker knew too much and was threatening to reveal the mafia's money laundering operations through the Vatican. In 2002, forensic analysis of Calvi's body revealed he couldn't have hanged himself. The bricks in his pockets, the position of the noose, and the absence of evidence of self-inflicted death all indicated murder. 4 people, including Calò and Lizio Gelli, were tried for Calvi's murder in 2005, but acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The Vatican never opened its archives to investigators, never revealed the full extent of its dealings with Calvi, and never explained how an institution founded to manage funds for religious works became entangled with criminal organizations. The Vatican Bank, formally established by Pope Pius XII in 1942 during World War II, operates from a medieval tower, the Tower of Nicholas V, inside Vatican City with no public entrance, no website for customers, and financial statements released only to a select few. It maintains approximately 33,000 accounts for religious orders, clergy, Vatican employees, and diplomatic missions. But for decades it also maintained accounts for Italian politicians, businessmen, and individuals with questionable connections. The bank's unique status, operating within a sovereign state with no external oversight, bound by no international banking regulations until recently, and protected by absolute secrecy, guaranteed by canon law, made it an irresistible vehicle for moving money outside normal channels. During the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, Archbishop Marcinkus, who had no banking experience before his appointment, worked closely with Michele Sindona, a Sicilian financier with mafia connections who controlled banks in Italy and the United States. Sindona convinced Marcinkus to invest Vatican funds in his enterprises, promising high returns. When Sindona's empire collapsed in 1974, with losses exceeding $300 million, the Vatican quietly absorbed losses estimated at $55 million. Sindona fled to the United States, was extradited to Italy, convicted of ordering the 1979 murder of lawyer Giorgio Ambrosoli, who had been investigating his fraudulent banks, and died in his Italian prison cell in 1986 from cyanide poisoning, officially ruled as a self-inflicted death, though many suspected murder to silence him. Before Sindona's fall, he introduced Marcinkus to Roberto Calvi, who seemed more competent, more sophisticated, more trustworthy. Banco Ambrosiano, under Calvi's leadership, became the Vatican's primary banking partner, with the IOR holding 6% of Ambrosiano shares directly and controlling significantly more through subsidiaries. The relationship allowed both institutions to profit. Calvi gained legitimacy and access to Vatican diplomatic channels for moving money internationally, while the Vatican earned substantial returns. But Calvi was using Banco Ambrosiano to lend billions to Latin American shell companies that existed only on paper, companies with names like Manic S.A., Astolfine S.A., and United Trading Corporation, registered in Panama and controlled by Calvi himself through the Vatican Bank. The money was then used to manipulate stock prices, fund political parties, pay bribes, and support anti-communist operations in Latin America, possibly including the Contras in Nicaragua. When the scheme collapsed, Banco Ambrosiano owed creditors $1.3 billion. The Vatican initially denied responsibility, claiming it had merely provided letters of patronage for the shell companies, not guarantees of debt. But in 1984, facing international pressure and potential exposure of more damaging details, the Vatican Bank agreed to pay $244 million to Ambrosiano's creditors in recognition of moral involvement while admitting no legal liability. The settlement, arranged by Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, the Secretary of State, effectively bought silence creditors, received partial compensation, and stopped investigating the Vatican's role. The P2 Lodge, which infiltrated the scandal's core, revealed how secret societies operated within and around Vatican power structures. Propaganda Dua, a Masonic lodge that technically wasn't supposed to exist since the Catholic Church had forbidden membership in Freemasonry under penalty of excommunication since 1738, included among its members Italian intelligence chiefs, military generals, cabinet ministers, journalists, judges, police commanders, and businessmen, including Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona. The lodge's leader, Licio Gelli, a former fascist who had fought for Mussolini's puppet republic and allegedly helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America, maintained a list of 962 members discovered during a 1981 police raid on his villa in Arezzo. The list, found hidden in a false bottom in Gelli's daughter's suitcase, revealed that P2 had infiltrated every major Italian institution with a plan called the Plan for Democratic Rebirth, which outlined how to subvert Italian democracy and install an authoritarian government. The plan included controlling media, manipulating the judiciary, and creating economic crises to justify emergency measures. When the list became public, the Italian government fell, and a parliamentary commission investigated P2 for 2 years. The commission's report concluded that P2 was a secret structure which had the incredible capacity to control the state. What the investigation also revealed was P2's connections to the Vatican not just through Calvi and the bank, but through rumors of clerical members, possibly including bishops, though names were never officially confirmed. The Vatican denied any institutional connection to P2, but documents showed that Marcinkus and other IOR officials had attended meetings with known P2 members, and that Vatican diplomatic pouches exempt from customs inspection had allegedly been used to transport documents and possibly money for the organization. Some investigators believed P2 represented a continuation of the anti-communist stay-behind networks like Operation Gladio, funded partly through the Vatican during the Cold War to prepare for potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe, suggesting the Church's alliance with right-wing power structures extended far beyond spiritual concerns. Opus Dei, unlike P2, operates openly as a Catholic prelature, yet it maintains a level of secrecy and influence that has generated decades of speculation and criticism. Founded in Madrid in 1928 by Spanish priest José María Escrivá de Balaguer during the political turmoil preceding the Spanish Civil War, Opus Dei promotes sanctification through ordinary work and encourages members to reach positions of influence in society while maintaining deep Catholic orthodoxy. Escrivá, who supported Francisco Franco's fascist regime in Spain and called Franco's victory over Republican forces a miracle, established an organization with 3 levels of membership. Numeraries who live in Opus Dei centers and practice celibacy, associates who are celibate but live independently, and supernumeraries who are typically married and live conventional lives. The organization grew rapidly under Franco, whose dictatorship granted Opus Dei members prominent positions in government and education. By the 1962, Opus Dei members dominated Spanish economics ministries and engineered Spain's economic liberalization. The organization expanded internationally, establishing centers in Rome, the United States, Latin America, and across Europe. What disturbed critics was Opus Dei's practice of secrecy. Members were encouraged not to reveal their affiliation publicly. Communication with family was sometimes restricted for numeraries, and the organization's finances were opaque. Former members described psychological pressure, intensive indoctrination, and practices like wearing the cilice and using the discipline for self-mortification, ascetic practices common in medieval monasticism but startling in modern context. Despite controversy, Pope John Paul II, who saw Opus Dei as a bulwark against secularism and liberation theology in Latin America, granted it unprecedented status as a personal prelature in 1982, making it answerable only to the Pope and largely independent of local bishops. He also fast-tracked Escrivá's canonization. The founder was declared a saint in 2002, just 27 years after his death, one of the fastest canonizations in modern history. The speed raised questions about Opus Dei's influence within the Vatican. The organization's headquarters, a fortress-like building at Viale Bruno Buosi in Rome near the Villa Borghese, reportedly houses 17 levels, including underground floors. Opus Dei's members allegedly include prominent politicians, jurists, businessmen, and Vatican officials, though the organization releases no membership lists. When the organization's influence on Vatican bank reforms was reported in the 1982, with Opus Dei members allegedly pushing for Marcinkus's removal, it suggested the prelature operated as a power faction within church politics. The appointment of Bishop Javier Echevarria, a longtime Opus Dei member, as the organization's prelate after the founder's death, and later Bishop Fernando Ocares in 2017, maintained continuity, but also raised questions about whether Opus Dei had become a church within the church, pursuing its own agenda under cover of papal approval. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, another secretive Catholic organization, predates Opus Dei by 8 centuries and wields even more remarkable power. Founded in Jerusalem around 1099 as the Knights Hospitaller during the First Crusade, The order is technically a sovereign entity recognized by international law, maintaining diplomatic relations with 110 countries, despite controlling no territory except its headquarters at the Magistral Palace in Rome and a small building on Via Condotti. The order issues its own passports, stamps, and license plates, has observer status at the United Nations, and operates a global network of hospitals and charitable organizations. Its members include European aristocrats, wealthy Catholics, and influential politicians who are inducted in elaborate ceremonies. The order's Grand Master holds the rank of cardinal in the Church, and members can be expelled only by the Pope. In 2017, a bizarre power struggle erupted when Grand Master Matthew Festing, a British aristocrat, expelled Grand Chancellor Albrecht von Boeselager, a German baron, allegedly for distributing condoms through the order's charitable programs in Myanmar, a violation of Catholic doctrine. Pope Francis intervened, demanding Festing's resignation, which caused a constitutional crisis since the order claimed sovereign independence from Vatican authority. Francis appointed a papal commission to investigate, asserting papal supremacy over the order despite its sovereignty claims. The incident revealed fault lines between conservative Catholics who saw the order as a bastion of traditional values and Francis's reformist agenda. But it also exposed the order's opaque finances and governance. The order controls substantial assets through its global network, and its diplomatic status raises questions about whether it serves as a vehicle for wealthy Catholics to gain diplomatic immunity and privileges. Some investigators have suggested the order's passports were used to move money and individuals outside normal channels, though no definitive proof has emerged. The order's membership rolls are secret, but reportedly include members of European royal families, billionaire businessmen, and senior politicians, a network of Catholic elites with diplomatic cover and no public accountability. The clerical misconduct crisis that erupted publicly in the early 2000s revealed not just individual wrongdoing, but systemic institutional concealment spanning decades and continents. The crisis had been building for years. Cases in Louisiana in 1985, where priest Gilbert Gorty was convicted of molesting dozens of boys, and the Diocese of Lafayette paid $20 million in settlements. Cases in Newfoundland in 1989, where Christian brothers at Mount Cashel Orphanage had sexually and physically abused hundreds of boys for decades, while church and government officials ignored reports. But the scandal exploded globally when the Boston Globe Spotlight investigative team published a series of articles beginning the 6th of January 2002, documenting how Cardinal Bernard Law, Archbishop of Boston, had systematically transferred priest John Geoghegan between parishes, despite knowing Geoghegan had molested over 130 children. The investigation revealed internal church documents showing Law and other bishops had received psychiatric reports on predatory priests, heard from victims' families, and responded by moving perpetrators to new parishes where they abused again, protecting the institution's reputation above children's safety. Geoghegan was eventually convicted and murdered in prison. Law, facing criminal investigations and civil lawsuits, resigned in December 2002, but Pope John Paul II appointed him Archpriest of the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, one of the Church's most prestigious positions, effectively rewarding him with a comfortable exile beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Law lived in Rome until his death in 2017, never facing criminal charges, presiding over masses in Latin at one of Catholicism's holiest sites. The message was clear. The Vatican protected its own. Investigations spread globally. Ireland's Murphy Report in 2009 documented decades of abuse and cover-ups in Dublin Archdiocese. Australia's Royal Commission found 7% of Catholic priests were accused of abuse between 1950 and 2010. With some institutions having abuse rates exceeding 40% of clergy. Pennsylvania's grand jury report in 2018 identified over 300 predator priests and over 1,000 child victims in 6 dioceses, revealing bishops kept secret archives of abusers, sometimes literally labeled secret archives in filing cabinets, transferred priests to treatment centers run by the church that merely provided temporary removal before reassignment. and lied to parishes about why priests were transferred, describing child rapists as having health issues or needing sabbaticals. The Vatican's response evolved slowly under pressure. Pope John Paul II largely ignored the crisis, making his first public statement about abuse only in 2002, after the Boston scandal, and even then speaking in general terms about sin without acknowledging institutional culpability. His closest advisor, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who headed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, sent a 2001 letter to bishops worldwide, Crimen Sollicitationis, instructing them to send all abuse allegations to Rome, to investigate them in secret tribunals, and to impose perpetual silence on victims and witnesses under threat of excommunication, a directive that effectively ensured cover-ups continued. When Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI in 2005, he began addressing the crisis more directly, meeting with victims, issuing apologies, and defrocking some abusive priests, but he also fought legal efforts to hold the Vatican accountable. In 2010, when lawyers attempted to sue the Holy See in U.S. courts, arguing that the Vatican's central control over abuse policy made it liable, Vatican attorneys argued for sovereign immunity, claiming the Pope was equivalent to a head of state and couldn't be sued in foreign courts. The argument succeeded in most cases. Benedict's September 2010 visit to the UK, where he met with abuse victims and expressed shame, was overshadowed by revelations that his own brother, Georg Ratzinger, had been choirmaster at a German boys' choir where physical and serious misconduct was widespread. Georg admitted knowing about physical mistreatment but claimed ignorance of inappropriate conduct, a claim many found implausible. When Pope Francis succeeded Benedict in 2013, he promised a new approach, establishing the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors in 2014 with survivors among its members. Yet the Commission's most prominent survivor member, Marie Collins from Ireland, resigned in 2017, stating that Vatican officials were obstructing the Commission's work and refusing to implement its recommendations. Francis created a new Vatican department in 2022 specifically for abuse prevention, but simultaneously faced criticism for appointing bishops accused of covering up abuse, including Bishop Juan Barros in Chile. Francis initially defended Barros in 2018, demanding proof of cover-ups from victims, then reversed course after a Vatican investigation confirmed the accusations, accepting Barros's resignation and the resignations of Chile's entire episcopate. The pattern suggested institutional reform was grudging and reactive. In 2019, French Cardinal Philippe Barbarin was convicted of covering up abuse by priest Bernard Prénat, who admitted abusing over 70 boys. Barbarin received a suspended sentence and initially refused to resign, though he eventually did after his appeal failed. The conviction of a cardinal, unprecedented in French history, demonstrated that church hierarchy were not above the law, yet the Vatican never sanctioned Barbarin beyond accepting his resignation. Documents leaked in 2022 revealed that Pope Francis had known about improper behavior allegations against then-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick of Washington, D.C. Years before removing him in 2018, the documents suggested Vatican officials had received reports of McCarrick's abuse of seminarians as early as 2000. Yet he was promoted to cardinal in 2001. The cycle of revelation, denial, limited admission, and minimal accountability had become predictable. Victims groups estimated the church had paid over $4 billion globally in settlements, a figure that continued rising. Yet the fundamental structures that enabled abuse, clericalism, secrecy, institutional self-protection remained largely intact. Disappearances within Vatican territory added another layer of mystery to the institution's secretive culture. The most famous case, the 1983 vanishing of one 5-year-old Emanuela Orlandi, has haunted Rome for over 4 decades without resolution. Emanuela, daughter of a Vatican bank employee, lived with her family in Vatican City, attended a music school in Rome, and was last seen on the 22nd of June 1983 after a flute lesson near Piazza Navona. Witnesses reported seeing her talk to a man offering her cosmetic sales work before getting into a green BMW. Days later, a man called the Orlandi family, claiming to be from the Turkish Grey Wolves terrorist organization, demanding the release of Mehmet Ali Aker, who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II in 1981 in exchange for Emanuela. The Vatican denied any knowledge. Then the story fragmented into contradictory theories. Some investigators believed the mafia kidnapped Emanuela to pressure the Vatican over financial debts related to Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. Others believed that rogue elements within the Vatican itself were involved, possibly connected to inappropriate behavior by clergy or prelates. Still, others suspected Enrico de Pedis, a Rome mafia boss known as Renatino, who was bizarrely buried in the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare in 1990, a privilege normally reserved for clergy and nobility, suggesting he had powerful Vatican connections. Anonymous tips claimed Emanuela was buried in de Pedis's tomb. In 2012, forensic investigators opened his crypt in Sant'Apollinare. It contained only his remains. In 2019, investigators opened 2 tombs in the Teutonic Cemetery inside Vatican City, after anonymous tips suggested Emanuela might be buried there. The tombs were empty, the bodies previously interred there having been moved decades earlier during renovations, raising more questions than answers. Emanuela's brother, Pietro, has spent his life demanding truth from the Vatican, staging protests, appealing to successive popes, accusing the Church of knowing more than it reveals. In 2023, Pope Francis opened some Vatican archives related to the case, yielding thousands of pages of documents, but no definitive answers, just more evidence that Vatican officials had received information about the kidnapping, had conducted some internal investigation, but had shared nothing with Italian authorities for years. A second disappearance, less famous internationally but equally disturbing, involved Mirella Gregori, also 15, who vanished from Rome on the 7th of May 1983, just weeks before Emanuela. Investigators believe the cases might be connected. Both girls, possibly victims of a sex trafficking network that had Vatican connections or protection, but proof remains elusive. The Vatican's refusal to allow Italian police full investigative access to Vatican territory, the Lateran Treaty, grants it sovereignty, means areas where evidence might exist have never been thoroughly searched. The Orlandi case has become a symbol of Vatican opacity, a reminder that within those walls, events can occur and remain hidden indefinitely, justice deferred by claims of diplomatic immunity and institutional privilege. The Vatican's history of censorship and manipulation of knowledge extended far beyond the famous cases of Galileo or Darwin. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books established formally by Pope Paul IV in 1559, was maintained until 1966, over 4 centuries of the Church declaring which books Catholics could read and which would damn their souls. The final edition, published in 1948, listed over 4,000 titles, including works by Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Hume, Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hugo, Balzac, Dumas, Flaubert, Zola, and Sartre. Catholic publishers were forbidden from printing listed books, booksellers from selling them, and faithful from reading them under penalty of mortal sin. The index wasn't merely protective, it was a tool of intellectual control, ensuring that Catholics encountered only Vatican-approved interpretations of reality. Even after the index's abolition in 1966 following the Second Vatican Council, the Church maintained the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the direct successor to the Inquisition, which continues to investigate theological writings and silence dissenting Catholic thinkers. Hans Kung, the Swiss theologian who questioned papal infallibility, had his license to teach as a Catholic theologian revoked in 1979. Leonardo Boff, the Brazilian liberation theologian, was silenced in 1985 for a year and eventually left the priesthood. Charles Curran, the American moral theologian who dissented from Humanae Vitae's prohibition on contraception, was barred from teaching theology at Catholic universities in 1986. Elizabeth Johnson, a feminist theologian, had her book, Quest for the Living God, condemned by the U.S. Bishops' Conference in 2011 for departing from orthodox doctrine. The pattern was consistent: question official teaching, face silencing, censure, or expulsion. The Church presented this as protecting truth, but critics saw it as protecting institutional power from accountability. Scientific findings faced similar suppression when they challenged church teaching or authority. The Vatican didn't formally apologize for persecuting Galileo until 1992, 359 years after his trial. The Church's acceptance of evolution came even more slowly and incompletely. Pope Pius XII's 1950 encyclical Humani Generis allowed Catholics to study evolutionary theory as a hypothesis, but insisted that God created each human soul directly and that Adam and Eve were literal individuals, making full acceptance of evolutionary biology theologically impossible, since evolution requires populations, not individual ancestors. Pope John Paul II declared in 1996 that evolution was more than a hypothesis, suggesting acceptance, but then qualified that the human soul's creation remained a direct divine act outside natural processes. Pope Benedict XVI appeared to backtrack, giving speeches that seemed to endorse intelligent design and question evolutionary mechanisms. The Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences, established in 1936 to advise the Church on scientific matters, includes Nobel Prize winners and distinguished scientists, yet its recommendations are filtered through theological constraints. When the Academy advised accepting climate change and endorsing stem cell research under certain conditions, conservative church factions resisted, demonstrating that science informed but didn't determine Vatican policy. The Church's approach to cosmology showed similar tensions. While the Vatican maintained its own observatory, the Vatican Observatory at Castel Gandolfo, run by Jesuit astronomers who made legitimate scientific contributions, official church teaching still treated biblical cosmology as containing truth that science must ultimately confirm. When the Big Bang theory was proposed by Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic priest and physicist, in 1927, Pope Pius XII enthusiastically embraced it in 1951 as proof of creation, claiming science had confirmed Genesis, an interpretation Lemaitre himself rejected, insisting his scientific work was independent of theology. The Church's pattern was to accept scientific consensus when unavoidable, then reinterpret it to support church teaching, maintaining the illusion that science and faith were compatible while ensuring faith remained paramount. Documents in the Vatican archives contain correspondence showing how church officials debated how to respond to scientific discoveries, not whether the discoveries were true, but how to present them to the faithful without undermining church authority, revealing that the institution's primary concern was always preservation of its own power and credibility, rather than pursuit of truth wherever it might lead. On the 13th of March 2013, white smoke billowed from the Sistine Chapel chimney, and the world watched as Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis. What most didn't see were the encrypted communications that had already begun flowing between the Vatican Secretariat of State and diplomatic missions in 180 countries. Within hours of his election, the new Pope's positions on capitalism, climate change, and migration would influence political decisions from Buenos Aires to Brussels. This wasn't ceremonial. This was power quiet, vast, and completely invisible to the billions who saw only a religious ritual. The Vatican operates the world's oldest continuous diplomatic service, maintaining formal relations with more nations than many recognize even exist. But unlike other states, the Holy See doesn't rely on military might or economic leverage. Its currency is something far more durable, the ability to shape what people believe about reality itself. When Pope Francis released his encyclical Laudato Si in 2015, calling climate change a moral crisis, he wasn't making a scientific statement, he was reframing the entire debate as a spiritual imperative for 3 billion Catholics and countless others. Within months, language from the document appeared in the Paris Climate Agreement negotiations. Religious leaders don't typically influence international environmental law, yet there it was, the invisible hand of the Vatican guiding the pen. This influence extends into spaces most wouldn't imagine. The Vatican maintains permanent observer status at the United Nations, a privilege shared with only one other entity, Palestine. This means Vatican officials participate in debates about reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ protections, genetic research, and artificial intelligence shaping global policy without casting a single vote. In 2021, when the United Nations drafted guidelines on gene editing, Vatican bioethicists were in the room, their theological positions becoming encoded into what the world considers ethical science. The Church learned centuries ago that controlling the questions is more powerful than controlling the answers. But the Vatican's most potent tool has always been its relationship with the unknowable future. For 2 millennia, the Church has positioned itself as the interpreter of divine will, the institution that knows what comes next. The 3 secrets of Fatima, revealed gradually between 1917 and 2000, demonstrate this perfectly. When Sister Lucia dos Santos wrote down the 3rd secret in 1944, the Vatican locked it away for 56 years. During that time, speculation consumed Catholic communities worldwide. Was it about the end of the world, nuclear war, the apostasy of the Church itself? When the Vatican finally released the secret in 2000, claiming it referred to the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, many felt unsatisfied. Some theologians, including the prominent Cardinal Ottaviani, who read the original in 1960, had suggested it contained something far more disturbing. Had the Vatican edited it, reinterpreted it? The genius wasn't in the secret itself, but in the Vatican's absolute control over its revelation. This dance with prophecy continues today through carefully managed apocalyptic narratives. When Pope Francis speaks about the throwaway culture, or warns that we may be living through a piecemeal Third World War, he's not making casual observations. These statements tap into ancient Christian eschatology, the study of end times, while remaining vague enough to be unfalsifiable. The Vatican has always understood that fear of the future makes people seek shelter in the familiar, and there's no institution more ancient or familiar than the Church. Every generation believes it might be the last, and the Vatican has positioned itself as the lighthouse in the coming storm, whatever that storm might be. Yet maintaining this authority requires controlling information with surgical precision. The Vatican Secret Archives, rebranded in 2019 as the Vatican Apostolic Archives, in a gesture toward transparency that changed nothing substantive, contain an estimated 53 linear miles of shelving. Researchers can access documents, but only those more than 75 years old, and even then, whole sections remain closed. What's in the archives about the Vatican's relationship with Mussolini beyond the 1929 Lateran Treaty? What documents exist about the ratlines that helped Nazi officials escape to South America? What does the Church know about the disappearance of one 5-year-old Emanuela Orlandi in 1983, who vanished inside Vatican City, and whose case involves allegations connecting the mafia, rogue bishops, and financial scandals? The answer is always the same. The Vatican will reveal what it wants, when it wants, framed exactly how it chooses. In 2020, Pope Francis opened some archives from Pope Pius XII's pontificate during World War II, supposedly demonstrating transparency about the Church's relationship with Nazi Germany. But researchers found the documents carefully curated, with notable gaps in correspondence during critical periods. The Vatican doesn't lie, it simply controls the narrative so completely that certain questions never get asked. This control extends to symbols and ritual that bypass rational thought entirely. When millions watched Pope Francis wash the feet of prisoners on Holy Thursday 2015, including Muslims and women breaking with tradition, they witnessed a carefully choreographed message about humility and inclusion. The Vatican understands that images speak louder than encyclicals. Every papal gesture, every choice of vestment color, every saint canonized sends signals to different constituencies. The 2014 canonization of Pope John Paul II and Pope John XXIII simultaneously honored conservative and progressive wings of the Church, a symbolic balancing act that maintained unity while committing to nothing. But the ground is shifting beneath the Vatican's centuries-old foundation. In 2015, the WikiLeaks scandal exposed thousands of confidential documents, revealing financial mismanagement, internal power struggles, and resistance to Pope Francis's reforms. Paolo Gabriele, the Pope's butler, had photocopied sensitive materials and leaked them to journalists. In 2019, another wave hit when Italian journalist Gianluigi Nuzzi published documents about Vatican real estate dealings and questionable expenditures. Then came the testimony of Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who released an 11-page letter in 2018 accusing Pope Francis and other Vatican officials of covering up misconduct allegations against Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. These weren't outsiders making accusations, these were Vatican insiders breaking the oldest rule, omertà, the code of silence. In the information age, secrecy has become exponentially harder to maintain. When everyone carries a camera and encryption allows anonymous communication, the walls around the Vatican City become less relevant. Digital leaks don't require physical access to the secret archives. A single disillusioned Monsignor with a smartphone can expose more in an afternoon than decades of investigative journalism. The Vatican faces an impossible paradox. To remain relevant, it must engage with modern transparency and accountability. Pope Francis has spoken repeatedly about cleaning up Vatican finances, addressing abuse, and opening dialogue. But the institution's power has always derived from mystery, from the claim to possess knowledge others don't, from the weigh-in of secrets kept. True transparency would mean acknowledging that the Vatican is a political entity like any other, subject to the same corruption, the same human failures, the same limitations. It would mean admitting that the emperor wears clothes expensive, historically significant clothes, but just clothes nonetheless. The question isn't whether the Vatican will survive the information age. Institutions this old are resilient beyond measure. The question is what it will become when the last secret is exposed, when every document is digitized, when prophecy loses its power because the future arrives too quickly to interpret. Perhaps the Vatican's greatest secret is that it already knows this future is coming, and it's desperately trying to control the transition between what it was and what it must become. And so, amid the echoing halls of St. Peter's and the whispers of centuries-old corridors, the line between faith and secrecy fades like incense in the dawn. From the sealed archives of 1612 to the hushed confessions of popes and cardinals, the Vatican remains our world's most enigmatic storyteller, a place where truth and mystery kneel side by side. As historian John Julius Norwich once mused, the Catholic Church is an institution for nothing if not for keeping secrets. Perhaps, in the end, that is its greatest power, not the treasures beneath its marble floors, but the questions it leaves forever unanswered. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your curiosity unconfessed.